Extend a warm welcome to you all this morning here for the service. The boys in the sound room, can you hear my voice? Yep, okay. They often tell me off that after the service that I'm not talking close enough to the mic for them, so thought I'd check. I'll run through the announcements this morning. Following the service, we have a fellowship lunch at 1:15 p.m. We have our band practice. That'll be followed by a youth meeting at 2 p.m. this afternoon. We have our usual online prayer meeting at 7 p.m. every Wednesday evening, and we're currently studying through the book of Isaiah. Following the service, the Maranatha Church members are asked to stay back here for a very brief meeting. That's immediately after the service. This evening, for those who are interested, there is a social evening out in the city. We'll be going ice skating. Now I invite forward our ushers to collect a free will offering. This offering to the salvation of souls. Let us unite our voices with the singing of our second hymn, hymn number 521. Hymn 521.
Thank you.
be seated. This morning we will be studying through the book of James. We'll probably only get through the first few chapters because there's a lot to unpack. The first verse in James chapter 1 verse 1 just gives an outline as to who this is written to. And it's not to any particular person or particular church like other parts of the New Testament, but it's to the broader church. It's to everybody. And there's some interesting points in these first two chapters. Some of them may seem a little contradictory, but as we go through, we'll unpack those. So let us now move on to verse 2. It says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations." Why would it be a joy when you're tempted? Why should you be happy to be tempted? It says here, count it joy when you fall into temptation. It gives a little bit of a clue in the following verse. It says, "Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." Okay, so we should welcome temptation then, so we can have a little more patience. You know, many years ago, as I was studying through this chapter, James is probably one of my favorite books in the Bible, I wrestled with this question until a verse came to mind in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. And for those who are following along, we'll turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We want to read verse 13. And this verse gave me a whole new perspective on the verse that we've just read. 1 Corinthians 10:13. "There hath no temptation taken you, but such is common unto man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." So if we bring these two verses together, what can we take away from it? Well, what I learned many years ago that really stuck with me was this idea of God trusting me. Why would God trust me? I'm a sinful human being that promises are like ropes of sand. But if God will not allow us to be tempted above what we're able to withstand, caveated by us relying on Him, then when a temptation comes my way, if I'm reliant upon God, not only can I be victorious, but I can think God trusts me to trust Him enough that I can deal with this temptation. Because if He won't allow me to be tempted beyond what I'm able to withstand, then if that temptation comes my way, God is saying, I trust that He's going to rely on me and gain the victory. It gave me a very different perspective. But there are a few other things that we can unpack from these verses. In verse 2, which we read, it says that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Worketh there comes from a Greek word which means to bring forth. So the trying of your faith, it brings forth patience. But in verse 4, we have that word patience again, and we'll read through verse 4. "But let patience have a perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." So there's a process here. There's temptation, there's patience, and there's work in between. But the word patience, if we turn to Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, the root word here that we've read as patience in verse 3 and 4, it comes from a root word that we find in Matthew chapter 24, verse 13, which was our key verse. Matthew chapter 24, and we'll read again verse 13. "But he that endureth unto the end, the same shall be saved." Now, we didn't hear work in that sentence, did we? but we did hear endure. The word endure in Matthew 24 verse 13 is the root word which was translated to patience in James chapter 1 verses 3 and 4. So if we switch out work for bringeth forth and patience endurance, does that change our perspective a little bit on the way this verse is read? Knowing that the trying of your faith bringeth forth endurance. And when endurance has her perfect work with you, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Now you may have heard it, faith referred to as a muscle, something that needs exercising. Now some of us here go to the gym, some of us maybe used to go to the gym, but if you want to gain muscular strength, is it the first 2 or 3 repetitions of those weights that are going to help build muscle and strength? Any feedback from our gym attendees? No? It's not the first few repetitions, but it's when your muscles start to burn and you now actually have to put in some real effort to lift that weight, that your muscle fibers start to shred and break apart, which later on builds and rebinds itself to grow newer and stronger muscles. So if we are being tempted, God is asking us to give our faith a workout, that we may build endurance. And it's that continual workout that will be found or will bring forth perfection. We read on, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and unabideth not. And it shall be given him. But this is caveated also. But let him ask in faith. There's that word again. Nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man thinketh that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. So if we want to give our faith a workout, are we going, oh, I trust God, I don't know if I trust God, and we're sort of turning backwards and forwards? That's like going to the gym and seeing the weight there and thinking, do I want to pick it up? I want to get stronger, but I don't know if I want to pick up that weight. It's a little bit hard. And that continual indecision, we don't do anything. So we're told here that if we lack wisdom, we can ask of God, but we need to ask in faith. An enduring faith, not a faith that wavers and wanders backwards and forwards. It's an interesting thought using a gym analogy here, because you build that strength externally with weights. There is another type of, exercise, which we'll circle back to, but the idea of weights, when you're really, really pushing yourself at the gym, think of maybe a bench press is probably the best analogy. What do you have there to protect yourself so that you don't injure yourself if you're benching a lot of weight? Do you usually have somebody else around or something there to help you? A spotter. I seen a video some weeks ago which really sort of illustrated this idea of a spotter and the spiritual analogy that will come along with it. This young guy was benching, I don't know how much weight, but as much weight as he could. And he was pushing so hard, I think it was his second or third rep, that he got about halfway up before he passed out. And you see his eyes roll and his head tilted, and he fell off the bench press. And the spotter was there to grab those weights to stop them coming back down on him. So he was there trying all his strength to sort of push that weight to gain that little bit of extra strength. Now the spiritual parallel to this is, if we are stretching our faith as far as we can, God is acting as that spotter. because we've read that he will not tempt you or not allow you to be tempted above what you're able to withstand. So if you're relying on him and you're stretching that faith muscle as much as you can, if it gets to a point where he goes, I can see that he's about to break, he removes that. He grabs those weights. Now, as I was discussing this with my wife the other night, the idea of calisthenics came to mind. That's using your own body weight to sort of build muscle and exercise as opposed to external weights. Can we draw a spiritual parallel to that? I thought, well, it's probably not a great analogy to use because it's an internal thing, and can we build faith and that from inside? Well, as it turns out, you can, but not in a good way. You see, in Matthew chapter 7, I think it's around verse 21, there's a group of people standing in the judgment, and they turn to God and they say, we're entitled to enter heaven. God goes, why should I let you in? And figuratively speaking, they say, well, look at our faith muscle, look at how strong we are. God's like, I don't know who you are. They go, we've done all this for you, and they list a list of things they've done for God. We've fed the homeless, we've preached sermons, we've turned people from the wrong way to the right way, because I don't know who you are. And there's a second group of people that he says come in, and they go, what did we do for you? And there's a parallel between Matthew 21 and I think it's in Matthew 25. There's another part or another angle of looking at the same conversation. And they say to God, well, what did we do for you? He goes, well, you've done all these things. And he lists almost the exact same things that the other people claimed that they did. They go, when did we do this? He says, well, when you've done it unto one of these, the least of my brethren, you've done it unto me. So they were exercising their faith, or their works, I should say, to show that they had faith, which we come to in chapter 2 of James. But the other group was self-righteous. They were building that in their own strength, not relying on God. So it wasn't really a faith muscle that they were building. It was a very different muscle, a very different attitude.
That's in Matthew 25, chapter
25, yes. And the other part is Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 onwards. We continue on. And this, we circle back to this idea in a few sections as we go through James, but we'll now look at verses 9 through 12. It says, James chapter 1. Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, but the rich in that he is made low. Now we'll stop there for a moment. When it says, let the brother who is lowly exalt because he's been lifted up, it stops there. But when it talks about the rich, let the rich exalt that he's been brought down, now we've got a few more verses built on top of that. But why would a rich person exult in being brought down? It seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? We read on, the second half of verse 10. Because as a flower of the grass he shall pass away. For the sun is no sooner risen with a burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falleth, and the grace of the fashion of it perisheth. Also shall the rich man fade away in his ways. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. There's that word endureth again. Temptation. For when he is tried, he shall receive a crown of life, which the Lord hath promised unto him that love him. Why would a rich man be exulting in the fact that he's brought down? You know, it goes on to say that his riches perish and fade away, and Solomon presents similar ideas, talking about the number of days that we have on this earth. And it's like the grass that today is and tomorrow is thrown in the fire. That's how short life is. I haven't been a rich, wealthy person, but from conversations I've had and what I've observed, many extremely wealthy people are worried that something is going to be taken away from them. They're constantly burdened about it. There's a wealthy businessman that I don't know personally, but I've listened to a number of presentations and that he has given. And he is a Christian. And he said, you know what the hardest thing is as a wealthy Christian? He said, finding a good cause to give your money to. I thought, would have never thought of that. But he had seen so many causes that on the surface look good, but really achieve nothing at the end, that he struggled to find a good cause that would bring a good outcome about to actually give to. And that's what he was worried about. Something else that I took from these verses is, where does our value or self-worth come from? Christ is the equilibrium here. The poor, the humble will be brought up to a level, and the rich down to that level. And that level is Christ. He was not a rich man in this world's wealth, but he used the means that he had or had access to do good to those around him. You think of some of the rich people in Scripture. Nicodemus comes to mind, who was a very wealthy man, but died a pauper because of what he gave to spread the gospel. The rich will be brought down, but rejoicing in the fact that they are able to give to a cause. In verse 12, we read a little bit about enduring temptation, and it went on to say that when he is tried, he shall receive a crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. You know, I think of 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, for those who are taking notes, but it's where it says that I receive a crown of glory that has been laid up for me in heaven. I'm running a race, and there's a crown of glory that is there for me when I win this prize. And it builds on this idea of enduring faith. But now we come back to this idea of temptation, and something that on the surface seems contradictory. Because in verse 2, we read that we should count it joy when we are tempted. And here in verse 13, it says, let no man say that I am tempted of God, for God doesn't tempt anybody. So then, should I be happy when Satan is tempting me? Or didn't God tempt people elsewhere in Scripture? If we wanted to look at Genesis chapter 22 as an example, and this is where it seems quite contradictory, Genesis chapter 22 verse 1, and we learn here, or we're reading about Abraham and his son Isaac. I believe most of us are familiar with that story, but we'll read this verse just to refresh our minds. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham. What did God do to Abraham? Tempted him. And said unto him, tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. And he goes on to tell him, take your son Isaac, and I want you to offer him to me as a sacrifice. This is a son who he'd been waiting his entire life for, a century for this child who was promised to him, and that a nation would come out of him, and now God is saying, I want you to kill him. And the words of Scripture said that God tempted Abraham. But here we read in James chapter 1 verse 13, let no man say he is tempted of God. Isn't that a contradiction? It appears to be a contradiction because of the language. Now, one is obviously written in Greek, one is written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Those two words in the different languages have a similar meaning. You could almost call it the same meaning, but depending on the context, that meaning changes a little. Tempted, tested is another way that you could put in there. We read on in this verse, "For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." So it reinforces that idea. Not only does God not tempt, but you can't tempt God. Well, hang on. In Matthew chapter 4, after his baptism, Christ, the Son of God, taken up into the mountain, was tempted. In Matthew chapter 4, Christ was taken up into the mountain and tempted after his baptism. But we've just read here that God cannot be tempted, neither tempteth he any man. But there are different ways you can look at this, and by look I mean translate. The word tempted or tested. And there are three levels or variables that you could look at here, and we'll go through them. When it says that God tempted or tested, he is providing an opportunity to do the right thing. He's providing an opportunity to do the right thing. He's not trying to entice you to do the wrong thing. Now, a few chapters later, I think it's in James chapter 4, roughly in the middle of the chapter, it says that it gives the second definition of sin. We know that breaking the commandments is one. The second definition, which I think is in James 4, it says, "To him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, it is sin." So God gives an opportunity to obey him, to do the right thing. When he tempted Abraham, he has said to Abraham, "I want you to exercise your faith and do this." That was the test. Did God tempt Adam and Eve in the garden? No. He put a tree there, and all he said is, "I want you to obey me." He didn't get the fruit and go, "Hey, do you want this? No, if you take this fruit, I'll trade you for something else." That's a whole other type of temptation, and that's the way Satan tempts. You think of Christ on the mount, when he went into the mountain. Satan tempted him. We won't go into the specifics of those temptations. Those three, they cover certain areas. But if you think about the way those temptations were phrased to Christ, Christ had to prove or trade something in order to receive something. Satan says to him, "You're hungry. You've got the power. You're the Son of God. Turn this bread to stone." He had to trade his hunger for this bread. Cast yourself down from this. Prove that you're the Son of God. Again, trading who you are or who God said you are for proof. "I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. All you have to do is bow down and worship me." Satan was enticing to do the wrong thing by dangling this gift in front of him. "If you do this for me, I'll do that for you." So when it says here that God does not tempt, it's in that context. God does not come and say, "Hey, if you do this, then I'll do that." God provides opportunities to trust him as a test. It goes on in verse 14, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed." The third type of temptation. So two, you could consider as external. One is a test from God, saying, "I want you to exercise your faith and trust me." The other one is Satan enticing you to do the wrong thing. The third one here, in verse 14, comes from within. And it talks later in the following verses, which we'll now read, and it gives this idea of either planting a seed or pregnancy, and there is this gestation period for this enticing. "Then, when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death." So it's this growth sort of cycle. It's saying that there is something inherent in me, a flaw in my character, and I observe something that resonates with that flaw in my character. Maybe I have a desire for wealth, and if I see an opportunity to get substantial wealth by a little bit of dishonesty, all of a sudden there might be this growth inside me saying, oh, it's only a little dishonesty, you can apologize later, it's okay. And if that thought is meditated on and entertained, then it goes through this process of conceiving and growing and bringing forth sin. And if continually entertained, that sin brings forth death. So when it said in the previous verse that God cannot be tempted, when Satan tempted Christ on that mountain, was there any sin or flaw of character in Christ that resonated with any sin or opportunity in the world to do wrong? No, there wasn't. The temptation that came to Satan was purely external. Sorry, not to Satan, came to Christ through Satan, was purely external in the sense of it's Satan enticing him to commit sin. In our flawed human nature, we have weaknesses in our character for each of us that are different, that can resonate with certain things that tempts us to draw us into sin, which is that third type of temptation. So God gives us opportunities to trust him. Satan entices us to do wrong. It goes on to say, do not err, my beloved brethren. Every gift, good gift, and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of light, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow nor turning. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So he's saying that God doesn't change. God's not going to come along and give you one test and then come along later on and say, no, I've changed my mind, I want you to go back and do something else. You know, there was a prophet in the Old Testament, his name escapes me, but God sent him from Judea into Israel. This is after the kingdoms had separated, with a message for the leader of Israel, the northern tribes, to do a certain thing. I think it was to tear down some altars or something to that effect. And he was told to go a certain way there and a certain way home, and not to deviate from that path at all. And on his way home, another prophet came along, and the curse was that if he didn't obey God, that he would die. And another prophet comes to him on this journey and says, God has shown me that he's changed his mind. You're to come and have a meal with me and do this. And the first prophet didn't inquire of God, hey, what's going on? Is this? And he went with this second prophet to this house and have a meal. And then God spoke through the second prophet, saying that you have been deceived. You've not trusted my word. You've been led away into sin, and you will pay the consequences. So he's lying, yes. Yeah, he was lying. And that's what this verse in verse 17 is saying, is that God doesn't change. He's not going to come along and ask you to do a certain thing and to trust him in a certain way one day, and then come back another day and say, hey, I've changed my mind, I want you to do this instead. We continue on with verse 19, and it talks about hearing rather than speaking and the way we are to interact. It says, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Now, I put in my notes that we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I'm sure many of us have heard this before. We should be twice as ready to listen before we speak. It goes on in verse 22, talking about being doers of the word and not hearers only, because if we're hearers only, it says that we are deceiving ourselves. And we circle back to this idea a bit later on in chapter 2. Verse 23-24, For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. So he takes a mirror, he looks at his face in the mirror, sees his reflection. For he behold himself and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth the manner that he was. It goes on to say that, but whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty, into Christ's character, into his law, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed as in his deed. So it gives this contrast. Someone who looks at themselves in a mirror, goes, yeah, I look pretty good today. Goes about their way and maybe forgets what they look like. But the one who looks into the law of liberty, into Christ's character, sees what he really looks like. Because we benchmark our appearance based on ourselves, which is kind of flawed in a way. You get up in the morning, your hair is a bit messy, you're looking tired from the sleep and everything, you go, oh, I don't look very good. But you shower, you do your hair, you get ready to go about your day, and you look in the mirror, and all of a sudden, I look pretty good. But you're comparing yourself with the way you were before you got ready. But that's not going to bring about a useful change. I'll refer to it as a moral benchmarking. Do we know what benchmarking is? Some of us might. So benchmarking is picking a level to compare yourself against, or to compare something against. And I heard this in political commentary this week. I won't go into the specifics of it, but there was a political person in a position overseeing a portfolio of some sort, and the question was asked to them about the performance of their portfolio for this year. I'm not sure if it was education or health or whatever it was. And they said, we're doing really well. We've benchmarked our performance against all of these other developed countries around the world, and we're doing really well. So to put that into simple language, if you take 3 random developing countries, country 1 is doing atrociatingly poor. Country 2 is doing absolutely terrible. And country 3 is just really bad. If country 3 goes, well, we're benchmarking ourselves against those other 2 countries, we're pretty good. But where have they set their standard? They've set their standard pretty low. If their standard was unmoving, then they could look and go, that performance is pretty poor. This happens in the education system today. I couldn't believe it. Many years ago, and it's probably too late for the teachers to do anything about it, I had graduated from school. One of my younger brothers was a couple of grades behind me. And instead of doing work for a certain subject, he realized that they had given the same work to do that I had a couple of years before. So they went to my old notebooks, they cut out my work, they glued it in their book, and they handed it in. They didn't do anything else. Do you know what? They got a higher grade than I did. And when I heard that, I thought, this is insane. How can that be accurate? And I was discussing it with a teacher some years ago and sort of mentioned this idea. And they said to me, well, the students are benchmarked on the other kids in their grade. So all that means is that for all the kids in my grade, I might have been average. But my level of work for all the kids in my brother's grade was above average. So he got a better grade. That's not to say the work was any better. That's to say what the work was being compared against was poorer. So this scripture here, where it's saying that we look in a glass and go, yep, that's pretty good, we'll walk away, is saying that's a terrible benchmark for your Christian experience. Your benchmark should be the perfect law of liberty, because that's unchanging. We may not get all the way through chapter 2. We'll paraphrase the first half of chapter 2. But the idea here is mentioned that do not be a respecter of persons. Now, if I was to ask you, it's probably pretty hard given the nature of the building here. If I was to ask you, what's the best seat in this house? The choicest seat. Which one would you choose? I see someone pointing to their own seat. That's the choicest seat. Same one. So it's a little bit hard for us to grasp. But in these verses and in some cultures, people are brought to the best seat in the house. But there was a best seat, so to speak. Sometimes it's the front row. You know, today we've got a PA system. People right down the back can hear. If you go back into the 1500s, at the back you may have to strain to hear, so it's much more of an advantage to be in the front. Do you know that before we had free will offerings in the way we have them now, because free will offerings, they go way back to biblical times, but the free will offerings, the way we have them now, is relatively new in the context of time, I guess. They came about in sort of the mid-12th to 13th century, if I've got my numbers correct. What they used to do, actually a bit later than that, what they used to do prior to that, to fund the operation of the church, because our free will offerings here, they go to keeping the lights on, to upgrading things, to maintaining things, paying insurance, that kind of things. To maintain the church, they would rent pews. The seats that you sit in, they were up for rent. And the better the seat, the more expensive. You know, I found in a book, and I'll reference it here for anyone who wants to look. It's a Catholic periodical, but in this research, they quote a number of Protestants as well, because the practice was quite common, and this is before Adventism. It's called Gathered Fragments, in the publication of the Catholic Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. And the title is Paying the Price of the Pews. It's a 3 or 4 page article, and in here they talked about how sometimes to build a church, they would sell, you know, a seat in the church. So this seat is worth this much. Someone would buy it in advance, and that was their seat. And as long as they maintained the yearly fee for that chair, they could bequeath their chair to the next generation. Could you imagine that? The pew you're sitting in now, you can put it in your will. So Pastor Miguel back there is like, when I pass on, I want my son Mateo to get my chair. To us, that's mind-boggling, but that's what they used to do. One wealthy person in this particular church paid in a bidding war, this is an auction, in a bidding war, bid $400 for his chair in the 1700s. Now, I looked for an inflation calculator. It didn't go back that far. I had to start from about 1913. $400 in 1913, adjusted for inflation, today is worth more than $12,000. The annual maintenance or subscription fee for that chair was an additional $400. Could you imagine paying $12,000 to choose the chair you're sitting in? And then every year the treasurer comes along, hey, or every 6 months, another $6,000, another $12,000 to maintain your seat. To us, that sounds ludicrous. But in these verses here in James, that's this mentality that's being addressed. Because it's saying that if somebody comes into your building, into your church, and they've got a nice suit on and they're wearing expensive jewelry, you're going to go, hey, this is a wealthy person. Let's give them the best seat in the house. This, $12,000 a year chair. You come and sit here. In that same article, different pews were rented at different prices. Widows were charged 50 cents a year. See the difference in that? 50 cents a year. And the chairs differed. The pews at the front, they had backrests. And at the back, they were just stools with no backrests. And then you had standing room only. You had to pay to stand in the church. There's a couple of us going back to Timor in a week or so to try and complete this residence. But just recently, the Pope visited Timor. You see some of the videos online. Thousands of people lining the streets just to walk along behind the Pope. But do you know that they charged people, in comparison, a good day's salary is $5 or $6 a day. They charged people $5 per person just to be in the crowd where the Pope was. So this practice to us seems ludicrous, but in some places this idea still goes on. But a widow, 50 cents. They get a little stool at the back or some standing room. Wealthy person, $12,000 a year. You can sit up the front. And the words here in James, it's saying, don't respect the person. If someone walks in just because they look rich, you don't have to give them the best seat in the house. Or just because someone is poor, don't push them to the back corner where they strain to sort of hear the gospel message. We should treat everyone equally. They're all souls to be saved. Christ ate with sinners and publicans, as well as speaking with Pharisees like Nicodemus and others that he met with.
Chapter 1, verse 1 up to 9, they say respecting persons is a sin.
A sin, to be a respecter of persons, yes. And this is building on that idea that if we respect people just because of their position or status, it's a sin. Go on, and we'll just briefly summarize the last half as we conclude. Verse 17, even so, faith, if it hath not works, is dead being alone. Going back to this gym analogy, we have some medical professionals in the house. What is muscle atrophy? Muscle atrophy. It's a big word, makes me sound smarter than I am. It's when your muscles waste away. Many years ago, I injured myself. I injured my leg with a chainsaw of all things. I was in hospital for, I can't remember, about 4 to 6 weeks. Had to have a couple of operations. And then when I left hospital, I was on crutches for another approximate 4 to 6 weeks. And I had to go to the hospital every day, get the dressing and everything changed. There was a couple of operations, skin graft. But then the doctor said to me, he goes, at the end of this week, you can start walking again. See, here I am, after, close to 3 months of not walking, either laying in bed or on crutches. I'm sitting on the edge of the bed. I take all the bandages and everything off my leg and I get up to walk. I take a step with my left leg. I put weight on my left leg and went straight to the floor. My leg couldn't support my weight. And I got up and I tried a second time and to the floor again. And I had to use the crutches for another week or so to support myself while I put a bit of weight on my leg to build back strength. Because I hadn't used my leg for close to 3 months while it was healing, the muscle strength deteriorated. I could look at my legs. They didn't look that different. But the strength in one had deteriorated because for 3 months it hadn't been used. That's muscle atrophy, when the muscle sort of wastes away. And it says here, even so, if faith hath not works, it's dead being alone. If we say that we have faith, but we don't exercise that faith, then our faith will get a spiritual muscle atrophy. It will waste away and have no strength. So then when it comes time to rely on God for something, we don't have the spiritual strength or faith to do that. I'll leave you with that thought, and we'll pick up the remainder of the book of James next time I have the opportunity. But I want to leave you with this idea of exercising our faith. Maybe once upon a time we had a strong faith. Maybe we've never had that strong of faith. But whether we've had in the past a strong faith or not is somewhat irrelevant to where we are now, because if we have ceased to exercise that faith, then it may have been strong then, but it may not be strong now. If we've never exercised our faith, then when we are in a position where we need to lift something in our life that's really heavy up to God in prayer, we won't have that strength. We need to start by lifting smaller weights, smaller everyday things up to God in prayer. And that as we exercise that faith, He will test us, not tempt, test us with stronger and stronger weights. But He's promised to be there as our spiritual spotter, that He won't allow us to be tempted above what we're able to bear. He's given us that promise. So let us each leave here today knowing that God has promised to help us to grow our faith. And that as we grow our faith, we may share our knowledge and our experience with others, that they too may learn of Him. Amen. Let us unite our voices in closing song with the singing of hymn number 441. The first